Okay, let's have a word of prayer. Dear gracious Heavenly Father, as we come to you this morning, we invite your Holy Spirit to guide and direct our minds as we continue to examine the foundation of this movement and to see things that we have never seen before. Help us, Lord, to correct any errors we may have in our understanding of truth. And we ask, Lord, that you can affirm and establish that which is true, the foundation of this message. And we pray for insight and wisdom and discernment. And we pray, Lord, for this movement and the people in it, that you can help them find the truth and that all that are searching will be drawn to this truth. Thank you for hearing our prayer. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, good morning, everyone. Now, we have, we're going to be looking at Heidi Hikes again, some things that we had touched on that we need to sort of clean up. And this has to do with his very cleverly disguised deception, where he talks about the time setting in connection with the daily. And so he gave us some references, which I've then researched and found that basically they don't say what he's saying, even though he quotes them. But he talks about this here again. So we're going to read this paragraph. Why did some even begin to set new dates for Christ's second advent? Now, he makes this argument. It was because of their failure to accept their mistake in their definition of the sanctuary after the great disappointment, when Christ had not come as expected to cleanse the earth. A determined examination of the scriptures brought the more accurate understanding that the sanctuary in Daniel 8:14 was the heavenly sanctuary, and that Jesus had just entered the second apartment to begin the antitypical Day of Atonement. Fortunately, some accepted the light of instruction. With that unmistakable light, the searching faithful ones in the Advent movement, if they had not already done so, accepted the glorious ministry of Christ. Unfortunately, others rejected that same light on the sanctuary. So now he's going to basically equate those who reject Christ's heavenly ministry as the daily are going to be classed with those who rejected the light on the sanctuary being the heavenly sanctuary. And of course, this is really not connected at all. So he's going to depict that those who continue to follow the light and came to the understanding of the ministry of Christ in the heavenly sanctuary, that when they applied it to the daily, that this was just a continuation of this increase of light. But we can see that this isn't really the case. This isn't really what was happening. And of course, he's used specific types of language and has tried to set the stage for what he's going to say. He's preparing the person's mind. The person who's not aware of what he's doing is being led along by this paragraph. This is a pretty important paragraph in his argument, which isn't really an argument as such. It's more a posturing. It's really what he's using to hide his sleight of hand. Now, so we know that he's now going to try to equate the time setting with the pioneer view of the daily being changed, and it's kind of weird in a way why he would do that. Mostly he has early writing 74, which they've taken out of context. Now, what he's going to do, he says here in the next paragraph, it is no wonder Ellen White was distressed by the divisions and distractions that manifested soon after this sanctuary and ministry of Christ light was revealed. Instead of proclaiming the third angel's message, much time and energy was expended by both sides in propounding or protesting against different unsustainable times of Christ's near return, or new other views that would derail or delay the progress of the movement. So there are different types of ways in which people were seeing that Christ was near. Not everyone was necessarily time setting in what we would call time setting. The early Millerites thought that there would be a delay and that Christ could return soon. Ellen White was part of that movement. So even though they saw Christ having begun his work in the heavenly sanctuary, this didn't mean that they weren't time setting, right? In some ways, what we might call time setting. They knew that Christ had begun his work on the Day of Atonement, and that he could come, in their view, anytime after that, that he could close up that work. So even those who were accepting Christ's ministry in the heavenly sanctuary, this glorious ministry of Christ view, as he calls it, they still were caught up in some forms of what we might call time setting. They weren't necessarily setting specific dates, but they might say, maybe he's going to come in a year. Maybe the Day of Atonement is a day for a year. And so they might expect that maybe he's going to come in the fall of 45, things like that. Now, what he's going to try to do is connect this with the daily. So then about 1849, a new argument was introduced, and a new basis for the 2300-year calculation was projected by nominal Adventists. Now, I can't find any evidence of this. That is, he makes this claim, and he's going to give us some support for it. But the support that he's giving is actually not for time setting at all. So they revived the supplied word sacrifice in relation to the daily, contending that this biblical pairing of words meant Jewish sacrifices and setting new times on this basis. Now, I can't find it. And since he hasn't actually given us any statements that show that people were setting time on this basis, I don't believe that there would be any evidence, because if he had found the evidence, he would have supplied it. What he's going to supply us is two statements from the same article, which is in the Advent Herald, March 3rd, 1849. It took me a while to dig it up. One is I don't have a PDF of it. Instead, I have a JPEG of it. So it's just a photograph. It doesn't supply the text. I can't search the text. And because of that, I couldn't find it in the usual searches. So I found it in another way. So he's going to take this quote. In the phrase daily sacrifice, the word sacrifice is italicized to indicate that it is supplied by the translator. The qualifying term must be understood as included within itself, so that the word sacrifice is correctly supplied. It is then the continual Jewish sacrificial observances which were terminated by Rome, symbolized by the little horn at the destruction of Jerusalem. In other words, how long will be the fulfilling of the vision in which is presented the termination of the Jewish service and transgression of Rome to accomplish the trampling down of the sanctuary and the holy people? Now, when you look at this, they're going to be addressing the destruction of Jerusalem. And then it's going to talk about the place of his sanctuary. It must consequently, we think, have reference to the desolation of the temple, which cast down by the Romans when they took away the continual burnt offerings, casting down the truth to the ground of its persecuting Christianity, as well as destroying the Jewish worship. But in this article, which I'm going to connect you to here, so I read through this article and all this stuff connected with it, because this article is continued. Here it is. So this is the article that he's quoting from. It's page 36 from the Advent Herald, March 3rd, 1849. And we're going to have these statements here. There's the place of his sanctuary. I don't know if you can see this or not. Maybe I'll zoom in. There's the part dealing with the place of his sanctuary. And here it's going to talk about the continual burnt offering. So he has these quotes taken out of this article, but there's nothing in this article or in this paper even that is suggesting time setting. So he's used some evidence that people had rejected the view of the daily being taught by Miller. And of course, this would cause confusion, but it's not connected with time setting. Unless I could see that somehow this paper, or that there is some quote or reference that shows this reinterpretation of the daily was connected with time setting, I would have no reason to draw that conclusion. Now, he's drawing that conclusion from Ellen White's statement, and then all he's doing is he's taking some statements where people have a different view of the daily, but he's implying that they're using this to set new dates, which it doesn't appear that they are. So to me, this is a huge problem in their argument, and yet it keeps being reiterated by others who are following Hikes. And of course, this has been going on with Froome as well. So Froome uses this quote, and so does Hikes, and so does Kaiser. They all use this quote where they have somebody who's doing a study on Daniel chapter 8, who now takes a different view of the daily, but it has no connection with time setting. So they're going to have this statement here of, well, I'll read this here. It says, Mr. Miller, perceiving the prophecy referred to the government of Rome, the fourth kingdom, supposed the daily sacrifice to be paganism, and AD 508 to be the point where it was taken away, and believing the abomination of desolation to be papacy, he deemed the decree of Justinian to be the point where it was set up. But we are led to differ from Miller in regards to the meaning of the daily, and from other writers referred to in regard to its application. That the Jewish sacrifices are alluded to by the term daily, there can be no doubt. Now, if you read this statement in the context of what he's talking about, who would be making this argument for it to be significant? Because why is he presenting this argument of somebody who disagrees with Miller? What's his reason? What's he trying to show? So this is somebody who's not connected with their movement, right? This is from a guy who wrote a book called The Lord Soon to Come, Boston, 1854. Has this any connection with Ellen White's statement in early writings?
I don't see it.
Yeah, so here he just finds some stray writer in 1854, where Ellen White's talking about a time setting that's happening in 1850, or she's not even necessarily talking about a time setting. She's talking about the charts and that time is not going to be a test again. And then they take a statement from 1851, which was added to early writings, and that's talking about some date that was set for the fall of 1851. And that would be, in my understanding of it, who would it be that thought that the 7 years, because we already found that out, who was it who thought that maybe there was going to be 7 years from October 22nd to the end of the Day of Atonement, October 22nd, 1844, which would end in 1851? What name were we given that believed that or was caught up in that? Do you remember?
Clorinda Minor.
Okay, Minor was not.
Okay.
Right? Joseph Bates.
Okay.
Now, in doing so, he wasn't rejecting the midnight cry. He was just arguing that because we have this Day of Atonement and we have this symbol of 7, that perhaps 7 years from 1844 would be the end of the Day of Atonement. And so Ellen White in early writing statement, that's a statement that's from June 21st, 1851, and it's published in the Review on July 21st, 1851. So it's published 7 years to the day from when the midnight cry is given in Boston, which I think is pretty profound. Now it ends up in early writings, just placed in the middle of this vision from October 23rd, 1850. Because it's relating to the idea that there's not going to be, time is not going to be a test, and that we're not going to be proclaiming time again. But in doing so, there's no way that this is connected with the daily, because would this with Joseph Bates be connected with the daily? Is Joseph Bates rejecting the pioneer view of the daily?
I wouldn't think so.
No, he doesn't. So Joseph Bates never rejects the pioneer view of the daily. And so the person that would be most likely to being addressed in this vision in 1851 would be those who are influencing Joseph Bates, or maybe even Joseph Bates himself, believing that, Christ is coming back in the fall of 1851. Joseph Bates is among those. There was no time setting that I can find related to 1850. So, and then we have this statement here from 1854. So obviously Ellen White isn't even addressing this, because this isn't even affecting her movement. It's not affecting the little flock. No one in the little flock is studying this. This is somebody outside of that. And also this is years later. So the argument that they're making, the narrative that they've been spinning, the Ellen White statement in early writings is time setting in connection with the daily, can't be supported. If it could have been supported, they would have brought the evidence to support that. Now, I haven't read everything about all the papers from that period. There's lots of papers, lots of articles, but I just don't see it. I would say it's a myth that there was time setting in connection with the year 1850 that Ellen White is addressing in early writings.
Or delusion.
Well, a delusion, but it's a narrative that was placed in regard to the new view of the daily to try to address Ellen White's statement, and it's persistent. But when you look at the evidence, there was dates. If you go back to the time setting, you're going to see 1847. And why 1847? Why would somebody take the time prophecies and set a date in 1847 for the end of the 2300 days? What are they going to be doing to do so?
They're having to move away, Mark, real directly, because they would have to not recognize either Christ's crucifixion at the date that we've seen it, or the date when the decree went out to rebuild Jerusalem.
Okay, so what they're going to do, I'm going to actually draw this here and show you what people do, or what they did to do time setting in 1847. And this goes back to, what is this? A rejection of the midnight cry, obviously. And it's a rejection of Samuel Snow's understanding of the week of Christ. So if you're going to get 1857, you're going to have to do some things that the Millerites didn't do to get October 22nd, 1844. So if you're going to have the 2300 days end in 1847, when are they going to begin?
That would have to be 454 BC.
Okay. Yeah, so 454. Does anybody know what this date is? What decree is this that they're going to use?
Isn't that the fourth decree?
They're going to use the fourth decree. So this is going to be what we call Nehemiah's decree. Okay, but they're moving it 10 years earlier, and this is based on Ussher's date. If you read actually Ussher, what he taught is he taught the 70 weeks began in 454 BC. He didn't begin them in 457. And that's because he has the first year of Artaxerxes being in 474. Is it that right? 474, where it's 464, right? So he moves it 10 years earlier. And this has to do back when we were studying Esther. There is a writer who talks about meeting Artaxerxes, and that's going to be in the reign of Xerxes. And so Usher and others made a mistake of believing that Artaxerxes was Artaxerxes, not Xerxes. And so in the way that Usher had done his chronology, he had taken 454 BC, and where's he going to end the 70 weeks then?
That's going to have, instead of ending in 31 as we would have it, it would be 35.
Okay, well, he end the 70 weeks in 34. So he's going to end them in 37 BC. Okay, and then the midst of the week is going to be 33 BC. And then this is going to be 30 BC for the crucifixion. So this is what they're doing. They're just going back. They're taking Miller. They're rejecting the midnight cry. They're going to preserve this 33 BC date for the crucifixion, and they're now going to place it in the midst of this week. And that's how they get 1847. Does that make sense?
Okay, it's a good graphic representation.
So this is what they did. Now, okay, look at it this way. Jehovah's Witnesses in early on accepted this view. I'm not sure what view they have now. I'm pretty sure it's the same view, that they have Jesus crucified in 33. At least they used to. They change their stuff all the time, so it's hard to tell. But that comes from Miller. And this idea here that Jesus is going to come back in 1847 was very popular because it seemed consistent with what Miller was teaching. They reject Samuel Snow's message as error, and they continue on saying, well, Miller didn't have the correct date, and we're going to go back and examine this. And when they get to Usher, they find, well, the fourth decree, that's going to be the one building the streets and walls. And so they're going to take Daniel chapter 9 and use that. Now, if I wasn't a Seventh-day Adventist and I was just studying, I would easily be convinced by this because there's lots of good support for it, from what they've done. Though I've examined this whole premise of Usher, and it was corrected. So all the Bibles in the 1800s, they didn't have Usher's date when it came to the decrees. They used a corrected date because it was found that Usher was incorrect in this point. But some people still go back to Usher. There are people who still accept this view. Now, they don't put the 2300 days in connection with it, but that's how they would interpret the 70 weeks. Now, some people will still just put, the 33 BC at the end of the 70th week. Or no, they don't. So they have to do it this way if they're going to start here. So that's how they would do it. So 37 BC. I'm not sure what they use, and I put BC. These are AD dates. I got to correct that. So yeah, those are BC. These are AD, right? So I don't know what they have in 37 AD, but the stoning of Stephen is very well established as 34 AD. So they're obviously not going to use the stoning of Stephen. But anyway, that's what was happening. So now, after 1847, what are you going to do when it comes to time setting? you can't just keep moving the years. Now, you could argue if you accepted the midnight cry, so you're going to have people who accepted the midnight cry, but just that there was a delay. This is going to be a different group of people than who set this date. These ones reject the midnight cry. So what other options do you have if you're going to continue setting dates?
Well, the way that that this is looking is that they wind up having to reject one and then continue setting others.
Yeah, so what they're going to do is they're not going to reapply the prophecies in the early years, except for the 47 one. Initially, they're just going to say, well, maybe it's going to be in the spring. Well, maybe it's going to be in the fall. Maybe it's going to be this spring. Maybe it's going to be this fall. They're just kind of in this tarrying time in their minds that somehow that Day of Atonement is going to end. Now, Bates takes the position that maybe it's going to be 7 years, but he doesn't get caught up, continually in this, maybe this spring, maybe this fall, maybe this spring, maybe this fall thing. But he is going to get caught up in the 7-year idea. And I don't have solid statement saying that Joseph Bates is who Ellen White is referring to in that early writing statement when it says that those who are bending all their calculations to the fall of 51. But I would think that Joseph Bates definitely was caught up in it to some degree. So whether she's writing directly to address him, he takes that position that that's a likely time for Christ to return, because they know the Day of Atonement has begun. And so it's going to end. But when's it going to end? Now, Ellen White is saying that, we're just watching and waiting. And it's kind of difficult in some ways to sort of understand that when we're so far away from 1844, at least for the average Adventist. There was sort of this watching and waiting goes on and on and on, but it becomes weaker and weaker. You don't have many Adventists who are really expecting Jesus to come back right away. Even 30 years ago or 40 years ago, they have this blessed hope, but they're not really expecting it to happen soon. They know it could happen, but they're not really expecting it to happen soon. But we got to the point where what's the average stance that you would find from an Adventist? Do they think Jesus is coming back soon?
No.
No, I would find that they would say it's a long way off. Now, the pandemic maybe changed things a little bit, and people are kind of like, whoa, some stuff is happening here, or the siege of Washington, things like that. They're going to look at this and say, this is a little bit strange. The world's getting crazy. But still, the average Adventist is pretty complacent when it comes to the second coming of Christ. Now, he's making an argument that Ellen White is talking about time setting in 1850. Now, of course, there is some kinds of time setting, but would they be connected to this new view of the daily or a different view of the daily? We can't see any evidence that it is. So it's a very weak argument, but it's the one they hang their hat on. And they've done it for so long, it's become entrenched. They've tread that path for so long, it's worn down by use, and few people are even going to question it. But yet, I don't see that they're presenting evidence for it. Any thoughts on that?
I'm thinking with the prevailing apathy, they may have just forgot about it altogether.
Who are you talking about? Forgot about what? I don't understand your comment.
The daily question.
Well, but these are people writing about the daily question. I'm talking about the people who write about it and talk about it. Even those who support the pioneer view of the daily, we almost have conceded the point that somehow there was time setting in 1850 that some way is connected with the daily, with these new views on the daily. We've almost conceded that, just because it's being presented so many times.
I'll have to admit the last thing I read on Adventist prophecy was probably God Cares 1 and 2.
Oh, yeah.
So my understanding is outdated. I didn't know there was still discussion of the daily going on.
Oh, yeah. There's lots of discussion on the daily. Well, the church keeps pushing it. So that's part of the problem. So you have, the Sabbath school quarterly from, the fall of 2012 when we were studying Thessalonians. And I've seen it creep up again and again in the Sabbath school quarterly. It's something that they're pushing. And of course, it's the Adventist view. But they're going to address this every time they present it in some way. They're going to present something dealing with Ellen White's statement. Now, that many Adventists have accepted that this argument is correct. Conservative Adventists who have now rejected the pioneer view of the daily and accepted the new view, they definitely have done their job really well. So in the context of where we are now in this movement, what is the importance of the daily? Or as we've studied through this, what is it about the daily that you see that it's essential to understand prophecy?
I certainly believe it gives us an advantage when the Sunday law crisis comes and our enemies use the new view of the daily to shoot down 1844 and the reason for Adventism to exist in the 23 days. Our understanding of the 2520 and the correct view puts us on firm logical footing.
Right. So we know that what's happened within Adventism and what's going to happen. So Adventism has undermined the 2300 days. The average Adventist isn't really aware of how that happened. They would still hold on to the 2300 days. They might not know about the 1335, the 1290. There might be some groups who still hold to 1260 and the 2300 days. And definitely the 70 weeks would be one that would generally be accepted. But they don't understand how any of this is connected. Now, when the leadership comes and tells them, as the Sunday law is coming, that Adventism was wrong and that we were wrong about the 2300 days, this is it's going to undermine the spirit of prophecy and all the counsel that we have there in regard to the Sunday law. So the church is going to spin this story that we need to cooperate in order to get our message across. We don't want to be seen as
peculiar.
Yeah, peculiar, I guess, is a good one. I was going to say sticks in the mud, but people who are behind the times, and it's just really those extremists, the fanatics, who somehow cling to all of the errors that were part of the Millerite history and part of Adventist history. And so we can see that this work of undermining the foundation has gone on for a long time. And just like that apartment building in Florida, one day it's going to come down. That foundation that they've undermined, those people are going to fall and be destroyed in that fall. Now, only those who have understood the foundation are going to stand. Now, when we think about this, I've had many people say, and even people in this movement, that we need to focus more upon the righteousness of Christ and not prophecy. And what's the problem with this in this context of what we just talked about?
That's giving more credence to some of the garbage that Prescott was promoting that led to the issues with Froome and others through the 1950s.
Okay, so it seems unreasonable in many people's minds that we have to understand prophecy and not just prophecy, but calendars and dates and numbers and symbols and
Amen.
complex things. And for many people, this is like, well, the gospel's supposed to be simple, and you're making it hard. Now, one of the arguments I've always used is when people start talking about prophecy in that way, I would say, well, how much percentage of the Bible is prophecy? And
35%, right?
well, it depends how you look at it, but I mean,
Yeah.
at least nearly, half of it we could just say is prophecy, direct prophecy. And then we have a lot more of it that is obviously implied prophecy because it's typological, it's history, and history, of course, is prophecy. So other than maybe something like some of the words of Jesus, which you might, they're parables or something, but they're still prophecy. I mean, I would pretty much say 100% of the Bible is prophecy. Even the genealogies are prophecy, but you could argue maybe there's parts that aren't directly prophecy in some way, or you can apply them. But the point is, the Bible's about prophecy, and Jesus talks about prophecy. So if prophecy isn't important, why is it in the Bible? Now we know understanding the righteousness of Christ and receiving his righteousness is important, but it's connected to prophecy. And we can't really even understand righteousness of Christ when we take it out of the context of prophecy.
You can't have one without the other. It's like taking the spirit of prophecy away from the Bible.
Yeah, they're all connected. So the message of righteousness by faith, once we talk about the doctrine of Christ, as Prescott did, and we minimize prophecy, we're actually minimizing Christ. Now, I guess I shouldn't be so amazed, but I am with how cleverly this argument has been woven into Adventist thought to reject the pioneer view of the daily, and then to promote this new view. Now, he's going to use a quote here from Loughborough. Now, Loughborough is referring to early writing 74. And so he says the confusion that came in after the termination of the 2300 days was first among those who persisted in setting times for the Lord to come. They claimed that the daily sacrifice meant the Jewish daily offerings. That made confusion. That certainly made confusion in what were the clear views before. So Loughborough says this. Now, is Loughborough a pioneer?
No.
No, he's not. I can't remember exactly when he becomes an Adventist, but he's much later. I mean, maybe not much later, but he's definitely later. He's not one of those in 1850 who's understanding though. So I think he's a young man then, or a child or something, a teenager around that time, if I remember correctly. But Loughborough is saying something that we still haven't seen evidence for. That is, they're stating it, but Loughborough may just merely be repeating what he understands or how he interprets that passage. So definitely in 1850, we don't appear to have time setting connected with the taking away of the daily. Now, one of the things we're going to have to look at has to do with Crozier. Now, Crozier's view is, and I'm just going to show you basically some of the stuff. Now, this is another paper by Kaiser, and we're going to use this sort of as a springboard to kind of look at this whole discussion of Crozier. And he's going to talk here. I think this is the paper where it's going to talk about it. Maybe it was another paper. I might have got them mixed up. I was looking at so many different papers. Yeah, it's going to be this one, where he's going to talk about Crozier's article in the Daystar Extra of February 7th, 1846. Now, there is this view that Crozier was teaching the new view of the daily. And actually, I don't think that is true. Now, in trying to understand this, I'm just going to read this first part here. So this is where we're going to be going. And just to try to let you know what we want to do. We want to tie up this whole loose end about the time setting and its connection with the daily in Ellen White's statement in Early Writing 74. Is there any connection? Is that what she's addressing? And so far we can see she's not addressing it. And there's no evidence been presented that in 1850, that somehow the views that had come in regarding the daily are connected with time setting. So definitely we can see that there were views regarding the daily in 1849, but they're not connected with time setting. It's just the undermining of Daniel chapter 8. But it's not setting new dates. So you can't connect that daily statement with time is, the Lord has shown me that time is not going to be a test, and that there will never be a test again, something to that effect. We're not going to see that that's connected with the statement regarding the daily, okay? So anyway, here it says, the apocalyptic prophecies of the Bible and the understanding of Christ's heavenly sanctuary service are an inseparable part of Seventh-day Adventist theology. So again, they're going to try to frame this, this argument all about this new acceptance of the heavenly sanctuary service. Now, there's a way in which it needs to be understood, and there's a way in which it shouldn't be understood. But it's almost as if anything that supports Christ's heavenly sanctuary must be true. That's kind of how they look at it. They shape the church's self-understanding and mission. Daniel 8, verse 9 to 14, both of these concepts are united. So obviously, prophecy and the sanctuary, the 2300 days in connection with Christ's heavenly sanctuary ministry. These are the pillars of Adventism. One of the key words of that passage is the term tamid, or tamid, daily, perpetual, continual, which is described in that passage as having been taken away and replaced with another service by the little horn power and restored after 2300 evening mornings. And actually in Hebrew it's just evening, morning. But anyway, does Ellen White ever make this connection between the term daily and Christ's heavenly sanctuary ministry? If this was such an important concept, wouldn't it be taught by Ellen White? Wouldn't it be taught by the pioneers? But it isn't. So the framework in which they're trying to pan this off on us is false. There's nothing about interpreting the daily as Christ's heavenly ministry that in any way supports the 2300 days. So it's kind of remarkable that they can make these types of statements without support. The correct meaning of the term was at the core of the conflict during the first decades of the 20th century that could have split the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Is that true? Is that true? Could it have split the Seventh-day Adventist Church? The correct meaning of the term the daily. So we know that there was a conflict at the beginning of the 20th century.
Sorry, I got called away for a moment. What document are you looking at?
It's a document by Kaiser called Guilty by Association, and it's addressing ORL Crozier's view of the daily. And so what he's doing is he's spinning this story that the understanding of the daily is fundamental in understanding the 2300 days in connections with Christ's heavenly sanctuary ministry. Now, we don't have Adventists prior to 1900 believing such a thing, that the daily is Christ's heavenly ministry. Yet he's trying to argue that it's fundamental. Well, if it was fundamental, this church didn't notice it for over 50 years. So I don't see how it could be fundamental. It's definitely a false idea. But he's saying here that in the 20th century, the correct meaning of the term was at the core of a conflict. Now, it is true that it could have split the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Was the pioneer view of the daily responsible for that, or was the new view of the daily responsible for that conflict?
New view.
The new view that's responsible. And he's not presenting this in an unbiased way in any sense. He says some interpreted the Talmud as Roman paganism, whereas others argue that it referred to Christ's ministration in the heavenly sanctuary. The topic itself did not seem to carry weight, yet its potential ramifications for the authority of Ellen White's writings and the belief in the divine guidance of the Seventh-day Adventist movement seem to attach much importance to the specific identification of the Talmud. Okay, so there's again a spin placed here. Now, one of the ideas is that Ellen White in page 74 says that those that gave the first angel's message were united on the correct view of the daily. And you have the people with the new view are now attacking Ellen White's statement. And you have one group who's saying, well, Ellen White says that the pioneers had the correct view of the daily. And this other group says, well, that's not what she's saying. But was the new view of the daily a reason for rejecting Ellen White's statement for many who held it?
Apparently so. That was the only justification they could find.
Right. So many who had the new view of the daily rejected Ellen White as being authoritative. Some to the point that they left Adventism, like Conradi. So the issue of Ellen White's writings is not in the way that he's hinting that it's about. Now, so what you have is you have a group who rejects really what Ellen White has said in early writings, page 74. And you have two different ways they address it. One group will just say Ellen White's wrong. People like E.J. Wagner, Ellen White was wrong. He says it's very clear what she's saying, and she's in disagreement with the Bible. Then you have another group who, after that time, in order to present the new view of the daily, have to rewrite early writings, at least in what she's talking about. So they have to reinterpret this passage to not support the old view of the daily, because they still want to maintain Ellen White's authority to some degree. Because if you're going to pass on this new view, to the rank and file members, you're going to have an argument better than Ellen White was wrong. So now you have to reinterpret what she's saying. And so you're going to spin this story that it was just a statement regarding the word sacrifice, and also that it was connected with time setting. So that's what you're going to have to argue. So while several scholars have attempted to clarify the factors that were involved in and contributed to the 20th century conflict over the meaning of the Talmud, only a few writers have wrestled with the question of how Adventists initially viewed the term at the beginning of the movement back in the 19th century. The few who tried to answer that question unanimously assume that O.R.L. Crozier's article in the Daystar Extra of February 7th, 1846, promoted the interpretation of the Talmud as Christ's continual high priestly ministry in heaven, in contrast to the Millerite interpretation of the Talmud as Roman paganism. Given that the article was recommended, there's all kinds of footnotes here, by Ellen White, by Joseph Bates, James White, and his wife Ellen G. White, that it was reprinted several times by James White, and that in 1854, Uriah Smith expounded on Crozier's interpretation of the Talmud. Previous scholars have further reasoned that the Sabbatarian Adventists of the mid-19th century must have endorsed Crozier's redefinition of the Talmud. Now, of course, he's going to clarify some of these points, and I don't know if I necessarily agree with him, but I do agree that Crozier wasn't teaching the new view of the daily. That is, you can't take Crozier's statements to be supporting what was understood in 1905, being promoted by Conradi and others, right? So Crozier's actually not making that argument. And so we're going to have to look at Crozier's article. Now, the thing about this whole issue, and I don't know how many people are familiar, people watching this, how familiar they are with Crozier's article. But if you read in Patriarchs and Prophets, and also in The Great Controversy, there's a chapter called The Sanctuary, and it's pretty much the same chapter in both those books. But it's really just Crozier's article. Ellen White is following Crozier's article. She's rewording it, but she's basically using all the same arguments that Crozier used in his article to support the Day of Atonement as being typical of what began on October 22nd, 1844. So I suggest people look at those chapters in Patriarchs and Prophets and The Great Controversy. And we're going to look at Crozier's article as well. Now, he talks about the article being reprinted. Now, not all of the article was reprinted. There were certain parts of it that sometimes were left out. Crozier's article does have some things in it that are not correct, that James and Ellen White did not support. Now, Crozier's going to be caught up, and that's one of the things we have to look at, is how much Crozier is connected to time setting. So that's one of the points that we have to address, because they're making the argument that the new view of the daily, or some kind of interpretation of the daily different than the pioneer view of the daily, is creating confusion, darkness and confusion, and it's connected to time setting. So we're going to look at Crozier's article next week. We're not going to look at it today. We're just going to kind of address what he says. He says, however, the assumption that Crozier's view was widely embraced is problematic, for all acknowledge that the old Millerite view of the Talmud as Roman paganism, and of course it's not Roman paganism or pagan Romanism, it's paganism, was the primary view several decades later at the beginning of the 20th century, when new controversy arose over the meaning of the term. If Adventists had already embraced Crozier's new view in the mid-19th century, it is difficult to see how the denomination would have reverted back to the old view by the beginning of the new century. To account for this point, some writers have suggested that both views were present in Adventism right from the beginning, with James White being the proponent of Crozier's view and Uriah Smith as the promoter of William Miller's interpretation. So people actually make this argument they don't really care about the facts. It's mostly just muddying the water. According to this explanation, although a small pocket of Sabbatarian Adventist leadership embraced Crozier's view, Smith's thoughts, critical and practical, on the book of Daniel, well, he has a lot of footnotes in here, 1873, had such a big impact on the wider Sabbatarian Adventist body that his view remained the dominant position within the movement until the 20th century. So he talks about the people who make this argument, but it's not a correct argument. And also we need to understand what Crozier's view actually was. It wasn't something that was in contrast to the pioneer view at all. The question that remains then is to what degree Sabbatarian Adventists embrace Crozier's view of the Talmud in the mid-19th century. The present article will first take a close look at both Crozier's ambiguous and explicit statements regarding the Talmud in Daniel 8, verse 11 to 13. Afterwards, it will examine statements from Sabbatarian Adventists that are the clearest in regard to the Talmud, and then move to the statements that are more ambiguous. Finally, the writings of the age to come Adventists will play a major role in this investigation. So Crozier became involved in this age to come. Now, age to come Adventism is basically, was laying the groundwork for the Jehovah's Witnesses. So the age to come movement had to deal with like a literal millennium on earth, and things like that. So how far Crozier got into agreeing with some of these views, I don't know, because I haven't read all of Crozier's articles. But this was kind of the direction that they were going. And it eventually led to, through different people, there's the guy, Barber, who was friends with Charles Taze Russell. And I think he was in Philadelphia. But anyway, they published periodicals that eventually predicted that Jesus was going to come back in a particular year. I can't remember, which was 1874 or something like that. And when he didn't come back, they said that he came invisibly to the earth. And they later set a date for 1913 or 14. And then when he didn't come back then they moved the invisible coming of Christ to the earth to that date. So there's a whole long history of it. It gets pretty confusing, so we're not going to look into all those details. But the point is, there's lots of different views floating around. After the dissolution of the Millerite movement, you have all of these different movements trying to reinterpret what had happened and to explain their disappointment. Some just out and out reject it as not from God. Others take parts of it and see that there's this progression. Adventism is the one that alone accepts, in the end, the midnight cry and comes to understand the heavenly sanctuary. And so Adventism is the one that comes out of that movement in the end with something that's solid. But you're going to see other groups, Jehovah's Witnesses, they exist and they come from the Millerite movement. Other groups that also come from the Millerite movement would be things like the Alliance Church, the Missionary Alliance, and also things like the Christadelphian Church. They would come from that. And there's other groups, all different kinds of Adventist groups. You got Seventh-day Adventist, seven-day, what are they called? Seven-day Church of God. You could even indirectly say the Worldwide Church of God comes from that. So we have all these different groups that come from this. But there's these errors or fanaticism that's coming in. And these are the things that Crozier's going to be involved in and others. But when you look at Crozier's article in 1846, there's nothing really there that is leading to this age to come movement, because that's later. Crozier was a friend with Hiram Edson, and Hiram Edson shared with him what he saw in the cornfield. And it's through the study of those things, Crozier and Edson together, that Crozier then came up with this article that's published in the Daystar on February 7th, 1846. So that is the truth of what happened. So Crozier Departing from that later is going to be where he goes into error. So it is the purpose of this article to understand the statements in their original context and put them into the wider context of the time from 1845 to 1855 in order to evaluate the suggestions made by former researchers on the topic. This article shows that Sabbatarian Adventists disregarded the Talmud aspect of Crozier's sanctuary view of Daniel 8, verse 11 to 14, because it seemed to be associated too closely with age to come Adventism, a ground for refusal that was no longer present by the turn of the century. So if you're reading into what he's saying that Crozier had this view on the Talmud that led to what we came to understand at the turn of the century in 1900, but that it wasn't accepted because it was associated with the age to come Adventism. Is this a reasonable suggestion? I mean, we haven't looked at all of his evidence, but on the surface, is this reasonable?
On the surface, I would think no.
Yeah, and why?
I think he's applying or implying too much in this situation.
So one is you got Ellen White and James White. If Ellen White and James White are agreeing with Crozier's view that he's overstating his case, because if you're arguing that Ellen White already accepted Crozier's view and James White, then how would you explain her statement that she has no light on this daily?
Well, that in that situation, it would mean that she was not being truthful.
Right. She would not be truthful because she would have said, no, this new view is exactly what my husband and I understood, just like she did with the 1888 message. She would have supported it if she knew it was the truth. If she had already been teaching it, she would have supported it. And of course, we can see that she doesn't have support for it, that they're misusing her statements. She sees it as a satanic deception, right? And that the issue or the controversy should never have come in. But her solution is not to just attack it openly. Her solution is for the people themselves to study this out. So they've taken her statements regarding the deity and twisted them. But now they're going to go back and really try to argue that Ellen White agreed with a view of the daily that's very similar to what was later accepted by the church. So when they say, that ground for refusal, because the age to come movement has no effect in 1900, that was no longer present by the turn of the century. Well, that's not really true as well. It may have not been called the age to come, though I think still it is. It was a huge issue at the turn of the century, the age to come movement. So that hadn't disappeared anyway. So the reason for, and I don't really see what that has to do with the age to come movement anyhow. So we have a new argument that this guy Kaiser is presenting that's different from other people's views. Now, of course, that's the scholarly way. Now, we're going to look.
Angela had a comment.
Okay. Perhaps in 98, one of the modern Andrews University grad pastors was trying to convince me and others that one of the divine figures in Daniel 7:9-14 was not the same Christ in Revelation 1, but an angel. I guess any concept of divine judgment and putting away of sins is supposed to be erased. I'm not sure I understand what that means. I mean, what does it mean, not the same Christ in Revelation 1?
Well, yeah, he was saying this is not Christ. This is not really a judgment scene. And And I said, well, it sounds just like the same Christ in Revelation 1.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, but it is Christ.
And then he was still trying to sidle away, and it got me confused. It got class confused. Yeah, of course it is. I said, I cannot see how it could not be Christ. And well, anyway, this is just the kind of garbage that's being flung around in the churches. It doesn't make any sense.
And what this does, I mean, from my view, for the average person, I mean, they're not involved in all these scholarly arguments, but these scholarly arguments, these types of papers that we have here, definitely confuse our pastors and our students and people who go through our universities. And when they come to our churches, what they have is a very weak understanding of Adventism, because they have all kinds of different views that aren't consistent with one another. Things are just open to interpretation. And so there's just so much uncertainty. That's one of the ways that scholars work. Now, in how we're approaching things, looking at the foundation,
right after,
what's
I
that?
think it was right after 2000, I had an email exchange with John Pauline, and he sent me a paper he did on the seven thunders, I think it was. And it was just full of theological jargon that he could use to impress his evangelical friends. He really didn't say anything.
Yeah, and I'm very familiar with this style.
I was very disappointed.
Yeah, because one of the things I learned when I took writing in university, I had a really good writing teacher. I took a course called writing. It was the highest course you could take on writing. It was what we called it was a non-fiction writing course. Creative nonfiction, fiction is what we called it. Just because we were writing articles on all kinds of different things. But anyway, the thing that she said about writing is whatever you're doing, the main purpose is to communicate your ideas clearly to the reader. That is, you want people to understand you. That's why you write. And that you have to write in a very clear manner, that you need to avoid all kinds of meaningless jargon and big words that actually don't help you. And a lot of the theological writing that I was reading at that time was of that nature, where you don't really understand what they're talking about, but you have to pretend that you do, because the emperor has no clothes. You don't want to be one who says, well, this is a bunch of nonsense. Of course, I was one of those who did say that it was a bunch of nonsense. And my professor was really happy when I pointed out the nonsense. I actually read a whole paper on a book where I showed that this guy's doctrinal dissertation was merely nonsense. And I got a really good mark for that too. So this is a problem in the scholarly world. Now, upon the publication of the articles, Sabbatarian Adventist readers were quickly persuaded of the legitimacy of Crozier's view. Because of their ready embrace of the article and its new doctrine of the heavenly sanctuary, scholars have assumed that Sabbatarian Adventists embrace Crozier's view of the Talmud as well. A closer examination, however, will show that this assumption is not valid. And I don't even argue that they understand what Crozier's view on the Talmud is. So Crozier's Daystar article is very clear on the extended atonement in the heavenly sanctuary, but it fails to provide an explicit and exact definition of the Talmud. Now, why would Crozier not provide an explicit and exact definition of the Talmud when he's writing about the heavenly sanctuary?
Because it undermines his case.
Well, Crozier's case?
No, sorry. I thought you were asking about this thing with hikes.
Oh, no. So I'm just saying, Crozier, he writes this Daystar article, and he mentions Christ, he mentions the Talmud, right, the daily. But he's not making the argument for the new view of the daily. So this person says he fails to provide an explicit and exact definition of the Talmud. But why would Crozier be doing that? Why would he not provide an explicit and exact definition of the daily? When
Well, Crozier didn't have an agenda at that time.
and he's not looking at the new daily. He's just
He was
accepting.
being objective.
He's being objective, right? So he's looking at Christ's heavenly sanctuary ministry. And when he talks about the daily there, he's not talking about the heavenly sanctuary ministry as being the daily. He's just talking about the daily ministry in connection with what ministry? In contrast to what? We have the daily ministry and what other ministry? The yearly ministry, correct?
The Day of Atonement.
The Day of Atonement. And if you go back, and we'll look at Crozier's article and what he's trying to say, and he's not saying the daily that was taken away in 508 was Christ's heavenly ministry. He's not even hinting at the idea. He's merely saying that the daily ministry becomes a type for Christ's daily ministry. And Christ's daily ministry is going to be from when? When does Christ begin his daily ministry? In the heavenly sanctuary.
And his ascension.
That is, yeah.
31.
Yeah, and particularly at the day of Pentecost, when the Holy Spirit's poured out on the day of Pentecost, Christ, that's the inauguration of his work in the heavenly sanctuary, according to Ellen White. And then he's going to complete his daily ministry. Is his daily ministry going to be taken away?
It can never be taken away.
It can never be taken away. And so Crozier's not going to say any of that. So what people do is they cherry pick some of his statements that make it look like he's talking about the daily, but in the way, the context of Daniel 8, verse 11 to 13, as somehow being Christ's heavenly ministry, that's then going to have to be taken out of the way. But that's not what Crozier's teaching.
Well, Crozier was just following Miller still, right? That's all he knew was Miller.
Yeah, so he's going to understand the daily. In a sense, he's taking a similar view to what we have just discovered, in that we know that there is a daily that is the true daily, that is Christ's daily ministry. And that what you see taken away or called the daily in Daniel is actually the counterfeit of that ministry. Because in order for the daily to be the daily, it is a counterfeit, and it has to be a counterfeit of something. So it's a counterfeit of Christ's daily ministry. But Christ's daily ministry is not what's being addressed as being taken out of the way by, I guess by the papacy, but in connection with France. So France is going to take away the daily. So we'll see this as we get into this. Modern readers, however, may find remarks that suggest an interpretation from the Old Testament sacrificial context. Crozier considered the sanctuary of Daniel 11:30 to 31 to be Jesus' sanctuary of the covenant that was cast down from heaven and polluted by the Roman Church. In fact, said Crozier, in the counterfeit temple of God, the Pope professed to do what Jesus actually does in his sanctuary. So they're going to pick and choose some statements here. But if you look at the counterfeit temple of God, the Pope professed to do what Jesus actually does in his sanctuary. What is the key word here? It's the word counterfeit. So if there's a counterfeit, there is a true. So can we see that there is a true daily ministry and there's a counterfeit daily ministry? And what's the counterfeit daily ministry?
Well, that would be Catholicism's Mass then, right?
Well, it's not just Catholicism's Mass, it's also paganism. Are both counterfeits?
Yeah, I gotcha.
Right? So the daily is the counterfeit of the earthly sanctuary. The papacy is the counterfeit of the heavenly sanctuary. But in order for the counterfeit of the heavenly sanctuary to come into play, does it do so by taking away the daily of Christ's heavenly sanctuary? you understand what I'm asking?
I wouldn't say it takes it away as much as just runs competition with it.
Well, it runs competition with it, but that's not the taking away of Christ's heavenly sanctuary ministry. It's a counterfeiting of it. So you can see Crozier is going to argue for this counterfeit argument, and that what the Pope is doing is he's counterfeiting the work of Christ, just as paganism did. It counterfeits the earthly sanctuary. The papacy counterfeits the heavenly. In seeing this and understanding this truth, this was understood by Crozier. This was understood by the Adventists, the Millerites, when they accepted the ones who became Seventh-day Adventists, Ellen White, James White. They're going to accept that the papacy is a counterfeit, just as paganism was a counterfeit. Through these statements, he deviated from the Millerite interpretation, indicated that the taking away of the Talmud could be a vertical activity rather than a horizontal activity. Now, is this true that Crozier does this? We'll find that it's not what's actually happening. And this vertical and horizontal problem is one of the things that I had to address way back in 94 when I wrote a paper on the book of Daniel, particularly Daniel chapter 8, and in university. And in trying to get my mind around what the new view was teaching regarding this vertical and horizontal, it really didn't make any sense to me. And so I used some theological mumbo jumbo, verbs and nouns and all kinds of words to kind of hide the fact that I didn't really have a good argument. But this is kind of nonsense stuff.
Well, when did this horizontal and vertical relationship start getting cast around?
70s. So again, this was new terminology. This is
That's what I thought.
Hassel and Shea, who are then trying to continue to support with attacks that are coming from within Adventism. They then try to create this vertical and horizontal argument to support their views. So we can start to see that people recognize that if you have this view of the daily, the new view of the daily, it's going to undermine Adventism. And so people like Froome, who they're going to also address in the 80s, this is going to be developed even further as an attack or support of the 2300 days against, not Froome, Ford's attack. So Ford is going to be attacking our interpretation of Daniel chapter 8. And so they're going to develop this vertical and horizontal terminology. He says, yet this view posed almost no problem to Sabbatarian Adventists who saw some room for papal activities in Daniel 8:13c. Since the article did not mention the daily or the daily sacrifice even once, it remained ambiguous regarding the Talmud, so that it constituted no offense for either view. This does not mean that Crozier had no clear view of the Talmud or that he did not intend to refer to Christ's heavenly ministry with those remarks. Argue that the opposite is true, as will become clear below. So he's going to make these arguments about what Crozier is teaching that really go contrary to what Crozier is teaching. Now, and this is what scholars do. I mean, they're kind of like lawyers. They're going to present, and this is what we're going to look at next week, starting on Sunday. And we're going to look at Crozier's article as well. So I'm going to get you Crozier's article so you can look at it. So what they're going to do is they're going to take things that people say and they're going to put a spin on it because they have an agenda. And it's going to look reasonable if you were to look at his arguments if you didn't know what we know, it would look quite reasonable. But as we start to look at it, and especially because we understand the 2520 and we understand what a counterfeit is, and that you have, in order to have a counterfeit, you have to have a true. So you have to have a true daily ministry, and you have to have a true heavenly ministry. So we'll see how that relates. So we're not going to read this right now. Any final comments on this? I'm hoping that this is going to be a profitable course of study. I mean, we spent a lot of time on this, but is there anyone that's really been confused about Crozier's article, that you've heard conflicting views regarding it, what he was teaching?
Seems like our theologians have never heard the admonition to eschew obfuscation.
Yeah, well, so shun obfuscation. Yeah, well, that's what lawyers do. I mean, you want to, if you want to win an argument, you have to learn how to minimize the points, the solid points that you're arguing against, and create some false straw man arguments. I mean, there's lots of different things you can do to win arguments, but it doesn't mean you're going to come to a knowledge of the truth. And so that's what we have to try to do here, is try to really understand what Crozier was saying. Because I think it's completely unreasonable premise that this guy is presenting to us, this idea that Crozier had really the new view of the daily, and that Ellen White and James White agreed with that view, but yet it was because of its association with the age to come that it wasn't accepted. And I just don't see that. I don't see it in any documentation. So he's going to create this case basically out of nothing. Right? He's gonna go back, and he's gonna do the scholarly magic, so to speak, and create this case. And it's going to be a new case, a new view of things, different than other people's, but it's still going to cause no understanding of the truth. So that's what we want to do next week. I would like to go on and get into this right now, but we don't have the time to do so. So you'll see. Now I'm going to send this paper to people as well as Crozier's article itself. And there's another paper that I have where a guy does a good job with Crozier's article. If I can remember what it's called and who wrote it, I might include that in an email as well. So any final comments?
None from me.
Okay, well, let's close with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, we are so thankful, Lord, for the way that you lead and guide. As we look at these problems in our personal study, Lord, I pray that you can guide and direct our minds, help us to understand the truth. And we pray, Lord, for those who are affected by error. We ask, Lord, that your light can shine upon them, that they can choose to follow the light. Help us to do the same thing, even if it leads in a direction that we didn't see before. Help us, Lord, to be founded upon the past experience and teachings of how you have led us. And we ask, Lord, that you can continue to lead this movement. May your angels watch over each person, and may you guide us until we come together again. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.